The First Amendment is something that, despite being a US principle, many all over the world will be familiar with. This enactment is responsible for maintaining free speech in the country and generally allows citizens to express themselves without fear of prosecution. Video games can be seen as a form of expression and speech, and so this poses the question of whether games are protected by the First Amendment too. The answer to this would of course have grave consequences for not just US gamers but the entire industry. And so today's video will be taking a look at this and whether video games are protected by the First Amendment. To begin though, firstly let's take a more detailed look into what exactly the First Amendment is. The First Amendment is an addendum to the US Constitution which reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Among the many rights it protects is the freedom of speech. Initially, First Amendment protections only applied to the actions of the US federal government. However, in 1868, the US Congress signed the 14th Amendment, which states in part, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." In what is known as the Incorporation Doctrine, courts then ruled that the 14th Amendment extends constitutional limits on government, such as those in the First and Second Amendment, to state and local governments as well. But it was not until the early 80s that US courts began to question whether the then relatively new medium of video games are a type of speech. The video game industry and their supporters argued that video games are a type of media, like movies, that tell a story through an interactive medium, and those games contain a large amount of art, music and writing that fall under protected speech. Critics on the other hand argued that video games are not a form of speech, but are comparable to games like bingo. While written rules and a good deal of talking might be involved in bingo, this speech is incidental to playing the game and thus the government can regulate it. They also argued that violent video games like pornography are obscene and fall under the obscenity exception to US free speech law. The industry countered that violence and sexual obscenity are not the same thing and that there is no legal justification for treating them the same. The ramifications of these arguments would have profound results on the industry, not just in the US but in the world as a whole. The US is the second biggest video game market in the world, earning over $25 billion in 2017. Restrictions on games in the US would likely influence the types of games released elsewhere. For nearly 28 years, US courts struggled to answer these questions, and various courts came up with very different answers until the issue was finally settled. Whether video games constituted free speech was first addressed in 1983 in the case of America's Best Family Showplace versus City of New York. At the time, New York regulations prevented a business from operating more than 4 arcade games or common shows without a license. America's Best Family Showplace filed suit, claiming in part that the city's regulatory scheme violated its First Amendment rights. Showplace argued that video games are a participatory fantasy experience involving both audio and visual elements, comparing them to motion pictures. However, the court ruled that whilst entertainment was protected by the First Amendment, it must impart an idea or information. Speaking for the court, Judge McLoughlin wrote, "In no sense can it be said that video games are meant to inform. Rather, a video game like a pinball game or a game of chess or a game of baseball is pure entertainment with no informational element." The courts ruled comparably in the 1983 case, Casewell vs. Licensing Commission for Brockton. In their ruling, the court stated that, although the affidavit indicates that video games might involve the element of communication, that is the sine qua non of First Amendment protection. For example, a player may strive to shoot down invaders. This showing is insufficient to demonstrate protected expression. While courts were not unanimous in this conclusion, for instance Altman vs. Palace Hills determined that video games deserve First Amendment protection, it was for a time the accepted consensus that video games were not protected by freedom of speech. As a result, these early cases upheld restrictions on when and where video game arcades could be operated. However, by the 90s, government's concerns over video games began to shift as more realistic and violent video games became widely available. In the year 2000, courts once again considered the issue of whether video games constitute a form of speech, when the city of Indianapolis passed an ordinance requiring local arcades to prevent the exposure of minors to violent video games. The American Machine Amusements Association, a group that represents arcade distributors and manufacturers, sued the city, seeking an injunction to block the law. While lower courts sided with the city, in 2001 the 7th Circuit issued an historic ruling that at least some video games qualify as speech under the First Amendment, and that furthermore they could not be restricted on account of violence because under US law, only sexual material can be classified as obscene. Addressing the applicability of free speech law on violent video games, Judge Posner wrote, "Maybe video games are different, they are after all interactive, but this point is superficial, in fact erroneous. All literature, here broadly defined to include movies, television and the other photographic media, and popular as well as highbrow literature, is interactive. The better it is, the more interactive." The court also dismissed arguments that the state has an interest in preventing minors from accessing violent material, stating, "Now that 18-year-olds have the right to vote, it is obvious that they must be allowed the freedom to form their political views on the basis of uncensored speech before they turn 18, so that their minds are not blank when they first exercise the franchise. And since an 18-year-old's right to vote is a right personal to him, rather than a right that is to be exercised on his behalf by his parents, the right of parents to enlist the aid of the state to shield their children from ideas of which the parents disapprove cannot be plenary either. People are unlikely to become well-functioning, independent-minded adults and reasonable citizens if they are raised in an intellectual bubble." The decision in American Machine Amusements Association vs. Kendrick sent shockwaves through the US legal world. However, some courts were hesitant to adopt it as a precedent. In April 2002, the court ruled in Interactive Digital Software Association vs. St. Louis County that video games were not protected, writing, "This court has difficulty accepting that some video games do contain expression, whilst others do not, and it finds that this is a dangerous path to follow. The First Amendment does not allow us to review books, magazines, motion pictures, or music, and decide that some of them are speech and some of them are not. It appears to the courts that either a medium provides sufficient elements of communication and expressiveness to fall within the scope of the First Amendment, or it does not." Later in 2002, the court ruled in favour of the industry in James vs. Meow Media Inc. However, it stopped short of saying video games are categorically protected. Instead, the court ruled that video games were only protected insofar as it affected the nature of the lawsuit. Writing for the court, Judge Boggs stated, "Our decision here today should not be interpreted as a broad holding on the protected status of video games, but as a recognition of the particular manner in which James seeks to regulate them through tort liability." However, the tide soon began to turn. When the previously mentioned Interactive Digital Software Association vs. St. Louis County was appealed to the 8th District Courts of Appeals in 2003, they reversed the earlier court's ruling, stating in part that if the First Amendment is versatile enough to shield the painting of Jackson Pollock, music of Arnold Schoenberg, or Jabberwocky verse of Lewis Carroll, we see no reason why the pictures, graphic design, concept art, sounds, music, stories, and narrative present in video games are not entitled to a similar protection. The mere fact that they appear in a novel medium is of no legal consequence. Cases in 2004 and 2005 came to similar conclusions, and by 2006, the courts noted in Entertainment Software Association vs. Granholm that the notion that video games are protected free speech under the First Amendment is becoming widely adopted in circuit courts. Despite these rulings, the issue of violence in video games remained controversial in the first decade of the 21st century, and state governments continued their efforts to restrict violent video games. In 2005, California passed Assembly Bill 1179 to restrict the sale of violent video games to minors. The law used a variation of the Miller obscenity test used to restrict the sale of pornography. However, in this case, the test was modified, replacing sexual material with violence. The law banned the sale of violent video games to anyone under 18 and required labeling beyond the ESRB. Unhappy with the law, the Video Software Dealers Association, an advocacy group for the home entertainment industry, filed suit, challenging the law's constitutionality. Both the District Court and the 9th Circuit ruled against the law. However, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger was determined to defend the law and took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. In November of 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States heard oral arguments, and on June 27, 2011, the court issued a 7-2 decision against the state of California. Speaking for the majority, Justice Scalia wrote, "California has tried to make violent speech regulation look like obscenity regulation by embedding a saving clause required for the latter. That does not suffice. Our cases have been clear that the obscenity exception to the First Amendment does not cover whatever a legislator finds shocking, but only depictions of sexual conduct." He further noted that video games are protected by the First Amendment, writing, "Like the protected books, plays and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas and even social messages through many familiar literary devices such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, and through features distinctive to the medium such as the player's interaction with the virtual world, that suffices to confer First Amendment protection. Under our Constitution, aesthetic and moral judgments about art and literature are for the individual to make, not for the government to decree, even with the mandate or approval of a majority." With the court's decision, the protected status of video games was secured. Video games are protected by the First Amendment, and furthermore there is currently no legal ground to restrict violent video games under US obscenity law. Had such laws been upheld, governments could have heavily restricted the sale of games to minors, and had the courts not defined video games as protected by the First Amendment, it may have been possible to restrict or ban such games altogether. However, despite these rulings, some continue to seek restrictions for violent video games and suggesting that things need re-evaluating.
And I'm a big believer in the Constitution and the First Amendment and the right to free speech. But there are certain things that are so graphic as it relates to violence, and things that are so pornographic as well on a whole nother front, that we allow to pass under the guise of free speech, which arguably are. But there is zero redemptive value. There is zero upside to any of this being in the public domain, let alone in the minds and hands and homes of our young people. We need to have honest conversation about what should or should not.
This is something that continues into the present day, and Censored Gaming is always keeping a close eye on any new developments in this area. If this is something that you're interested in staying up to date with, please make sure to subscribe, and until next time, thank you for watching.